Obese girl about to be hanged for stealing food for her 2 kids. That's what the whole town came to see. The rope was ready. The storekeeper's voice was loud. The little ones cried in the cold. No one cared why she did it. Until the ground shook with hooves. Out of the snow came a mountain man big as a grizzly, eyes hard as winter ice. He paid for what she took, but the rope wasn't the only trap set for her. The law wanted her land. The town wanted her gone. And someone with power aimed to take her children, too. In a place where justice wears the face of greed, he's the only one willing to stand in the way. But the truth she holds could burn more than just one man's lies. It could turn the whole valley upside down. Thanks for tuning in. These stories remind us that life is more than headlines. It's about heartlines. Subscribe if you want more moments that make you pause, feel, and reflect. The bitter January wind whipped through Snowcap's main street, carrying stinging pellets of snow that felt like tiny needles against exposed skin. Mary Beth Cullen's threadbare shawl offered little protection as she stood on the rough wooden platform of the gallows, her feet numb in worn boots. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she glimpsed her children, Timothy, age 10, and Sarah, just 7, huddling together while Deputy Matthews held them back with an apologetic look on his weathered face. The crowd pressed closer, their boots stamping against the frozen ground. Some folks pulled their collars higher, shielding their faces from both the cold and the grim spectacle before them. Horace Bell, the storekeeper, stood at the front, his neat black coat buttoned tight against the chill. His voice carried sharp and clear across the gathering. Let this serve as a lesson. Bell's polished boots gleamed as he gestured at the stolen goods laid out on a barrel beside him. 3 loaves of bread, 2 pounds of beans, and salted pork taken in the dead of night. Such brazen theft cannot go unpunished, else we invite chaos into our orderly town. Mary Beth's cheeks burned with shame, but she held her head high. The memory of her children's hollow-cheeked faces had driven her to that desperate act. The sheriff, a gray-haired man named Willard, unfolded a piece of paper with hands reddened by cold. Mary Beth Cullen, he read, voice carrying the weight of official judgment. You have been found guilty of theft and breaking and entering. The sentence is death by hanging. Little Sarah's sob cut through the murmuring crowd like a knife. The hangman, a squat man with tobacco-stained fingers, approached with the rope. Its rough hemp surface scraped against Mary Beth's neck as he adjusted the knot with practiced efficiency. Just then, a deep voice boomed across the street. Hold! The crowd parted like water around the stone as Jonas Rourke guided his mule through their midst. His buffalo coat bore the marks of hard travel, and his beard was flecked with ice, but his eyes blazed with authority. The mule's hooves clomped against the packed snow as he drew alongside the gallows. What's the value of the stolen goods? Jonas demanded, fixing Bell with a steady gaze. Bell's lips tightened. $4.50. Without hesitation, Jonas reached into his coat and pulled out a leather pouch. The coins clinked as he counted out $9 in silver. Double payment, he announced, to cover the theft and any trouble caused. He tossed the money to Bell, who caught it reflexively. The storekeeper's face darkened with frustration, but the coins in his hand left him little room to object. Sheriff, Jonas called out, I'm claiming responsibility for the widow Cullen and her children. The debt's paid. Cut her loose. Sheriff Willard hesitated, looking between Jonas and Bell. The mountain man's reputation carried weight. He was known for fair dealing with both settlers and the Ute, and his word was as solid as the Rocky Mountains themselves. Well? Jonas's voice held an edge of steel. The sheriff nodded to the hangman. Cut her down. The rope fell away from Mary Beth's neck, leaving a raw ring that would serve as a reminder of how close she'd come to death. Her legs trembled as she descended the gallows steps. Timothy and Sarah broke free from the deputy's loosened grip and ran to her, wrapping their arms around her skirts. Jonas dismounted with the fluid grace of a man accustomed to life in the saddle. He approached Mary Beth, his towering frame blocking the worst of the wind. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "you'll ride my mule. Children can walk alongside. It ain't far." Mary Beth stared up at him, trying to read his intentions in that weathered face. "Why?" she whispered. "Because it's right," he answered simply. Then, louder for the crowd to hear, "You're coming with me." The gathering began to disperse, some shaking their heads in disapproval, others nodding with respect at Jonas's intervention. Bell stood rigid, the coins clutched in his fist, watching as Jonas helped Maribeth onto the mule's back. The children pressed close to their mother, their faces showing the first glimmers of hope they'd known in weeks dot as they moved away from the gallows. Maribeth caught sight of Bell's face. Behind his proper facade, calculation burned in his eyes. She shivered, and not from the cold. Something told her this morning's events were far from the end of their troubles with the storekeeper. Jonas's boots crunched in the snow as he led the way down Snowcap's main street, one hand on the mule's bridle. Maribeth sat stiffly in the saddle, her children Samuel and Ruth clinging to her skirts as they walked beside the animal. The cold wind carried whispers from the dispersing crowd behind them. Samuel, his 8-year-old face pinched with worry, kept glancing up at his mother. Little Ruth, barely 6, stumbled on her 2 big boots, her small hand gripping her brother's coat. The silence stretched between them like a drawn bowstring, broken only by the mule's steady hoof-falls and the children's quickened breathing. Maribeth's fingers twisted in the mule's coarse mane. The shame of the morning's events burned hotter than the rope's memory around her neck. She opened her mouth to thank her rescuer, but the words stuck in her throat. What could she say to a stranger who had saved her from the gallows? Jonas led them to the livery stable at the edge of town, where a sturdy wagon waited. 2 massive sled dogs lay hitched behind it, their thick fur dusted with snow. The stable's interior smelled of hay and leather, offering brief shelter from the biting wind. "Your belongings?" Jonas asked, his voice gentle despite his imposing frame. Maribeth swallowed hard. Just a few things, at Widow Chun's boarding house." They retrieved their meager possessions from the kind-hearted widow. A patched quilt that had seen better days, a chipped tin cup that had been Daniel's, and the family Bible with its loose pages held together by a frayed ribbon. As they loaded these treasures into the wagon, townsfolk passed by with hard stares or turned heads. Outside the blacksmith shop, Tom Wilson swayed on his feet, whiskey bottle in hand. "Well, look here," he called out, voice slurred. "Rourke, you gone soft for a thief?" Jonas continued securing the wagon's load as if he hadn't heard, but Mary Beth's face flamed. She clutched the Bible tighter to her chest, its familiar weight offering little comfort against the drunk's mockery. Ruth pressed closer to her mother's skirts, while Samuel's small fists clenched at his sides when they reached the edge of town. Jonas pulled the wagon to a halt. He studied the heavy clouds gathering above the mountain peaks, his experienced eyes reading the weather like others might read a book. The wind had picked up, carrying the sharp scent of approaching snow. "Storms? Coming," he said, helping Maribeth and the children onto the wagon seat. "It'll be a hard climb to the cabin before nightfall. Best wrap tight in that quilt." As they set out on the mountain road, the sled dogs trotting steadily behind the wagon, the children's natural curiosity began to overcome their shyness. Samuel's eyes kept straying to the rifle secure beside the seat, while Ruth watched the dogs with growing fascination. "Mr. Rourke?" Samuel finally ventured, his voice small against the creaking wagon wheels. "Is that rifle for hunting?" Jonas nodded. "That it is, son. Helps keep food on the table. Are those really sled dogs?" Ruth asked, twisting around to look at the massive animals. Like in the stories? Indeed they are. That's Thor and Odin. Best team in these mountains. A ghost of a smile crossed Jonas's weathered face. They can pull this wagon through snow deeper than you're tall. Mary Beth remained silent, the Bible still pressed against her chest like a shield. She watched Jonas from the corner of her eye, trying to understand why this mountain man had stepped forward to save them. The road wound higher into the foothills, leaving Snowcap's judgmental stares behind Dot as the sun settled toward the western peaks. They stopped beside a frozen creek. Ice crystals had formed delicate patterns along its banks, and the last rays of daylight sparked off the snow like scattered diamonds. Jonas broke holes in the ice so the mule and dogs could drink, while Samuel and Ruth watched in fascination as the animals crunched through the crystal surface. "Miss Cullen," Jonas said quietly as he worked, "careful not to spook the animals or his passengers. We've got another hour's travel before we reach the tree line. The path gets steeper from there." Mary Beth nodded, adjusting the quilt around Ruth's shoulders. The dark wall of pines loomed ahead, and somewhere beyond lay Jonas Rourke's cabin, their uncertain sanctuary in these wild mountains. She watched him tend to the animals with capable hands, wondering what sort of man would take in 3 strangers on the brink of winter. The sun slipped behind the peaks, painting the snow in shades of purple and gold. As Jonas helped them back into the wagon, Mary Beth caught him scanning the gathering storm clouds once more. The wind whistled through the pines ahead, calling them toward whatever fate waited in the darkness beyond. The wagon creaked to a halt as darkness settled fully over the mountain. Wind whipped through the towering pines, their branches swaying like ancient dancers against the clouded night sky. Jonas's cabin emerged from the gloom, a solid structure of squared logs with a stone chimney that sent wisps of smoke curling into the frigid air. Jonas swung down from the wagon seat, his boots crunching in the deep snow. He lifted a brass lantern from its hook, its golden light spilling across the white ground like honey. The children stirred beneath the quilt, Ruth's small face pale with exhaustion. "Almost there," Jonas said, his breath forming clouds in the freezing air. He helped Samuel down first, then lifted Ruth with gentle hands. Mary Beth climbed down last, her legs stiff from the long journey. The cabin door opened with a groan of iron hinges, releasing a wave of blessed warmth. Jonas ushered them inside, where a banked fire glowed in a stone hearth that took up nearly half of one wall. The interior was sparse, but orderly. A rough-hewn table with 2 chairs occupied one corner, while 2 narrow bunks lined the opposite wall. Above, rough-cut beams supported a small loft space. "Fire needs feeding," Jonas said, moving to stoke the coals. He added split pine logs from a stack beside the hearth, and flames soon danced upward, casting flickering shadows on the log walls. The children huddled near the fire, their hands stretched toward its warmth. Samuel's hollow cheeks were highlighted by the firelight, making him look older than his 8 years. Ruth swayed slightly on her feet, exhaustion evident in every line of her small body. Jonas moved to a black iron pot hanging at the edge of the hearth. Steam rose as he lifted the lid, releasing the rich aroma of venison stew. He ladled generous portions into 3 tin bowls. "Here," he said, offering the first bowl to Mary Beth. "You all need food in your bellies." Mary Beth's hands remained at her sides. "We can't. You've already done too much." Jonas's eyes flickered to Samuel, whose gaze was fixed on the steaming bowl. "Take it," he said quietly. "Pride won't feed your children." The words struck home. Mary Beth accepted the bowl with trembling hands, then watched as Jonas served Samuel and Ruth. The children fell upon the food like hungry wolves, though Ruth remembered to mumble, "Thank you," between spoonfuls. The stew was hearty chunks of tender venison, wild onions, and dried corn in a rich broth. Mary Beth couldn't remember the last time they'd eaten so well. Warmth spread through her chest with each careful spoonful, though shame still burned at the edges of her gratitude. While they ate, Jonas climbed the ladder to the loft, returning with thick bedrolls. He laid them out carefully, creating soft nests of blankets for the children. "Up you go," he said, helping first Ruth, then Samuel, up the ladder. "Mind your heads on the beams." Ruth was asleep almost before Jonas tucked the blankets around her. Samuel lasted only moments longer, his small hand curled around the edge of his bedroll. Jonas turned to Mary Beth. "Take my bunk," he said, gesturing to the wider of the two beds. "I'll sleep in the chair." "I couldn't possibly." "You can, and you will." His tone was firm but kind. "You need proper rest." Too weary to argue further, Mary Beth sank onto the bunk. The mattress, stuffed with fresh straw and topped with wool blankets, felt like heaven after months of sleeping on the boarding house's hard floor dawn. Before settling into his chair, Jonas made a careful circuit of the cabin. He checked the heavy iron latch on the door, then the rifle mounted over the mantel. The weapon's oiled stock gleamed in the firelight, a silent guardian against whatever threats lurked in the darkness beyond the cabin walls. Mary Beth lay in the darkness, listening to the pop and crackle of burning logs. Wind moaned through the pines outside, and somewhere in the distance, wolves called to one another across the vast night. The sound sent a shiver down her spine. Though she knew the cabin's solid walls would keep them safe, her mind churned with the day's events, replaying them like scenes from a nightmare. The rope around her neck, the crowd's hostile faces, her children's terrified cries. Then Jonas's voice cutting through it all, his quiet strength offering salvation when all hope seemed lost. Now, here they lay, warm and fed for the first time in months, under the roof of a man she barely knew. "Thank you, Lord," she whispered into the darkness, though her voice trembled with uncertainty. The prayer felt fragile, like a bird beating its wings against a storm. What would tomorrow bring? What would this mountain man expect in return for his kindness? From his chair by the fire, Jonas's steady breathing joined the rhythm of the night. Mary Beth pulled the blankets tighter, surrounded by the unfamiliar sounds of their newfound sanctuary. Morning sunlight sparkled across the fresh snow, turning the mountain world into a sea of diamonds. The air was crisp and clean, holding the kind of stillness that comes only after a heavy snowfall. Against this pristine backdrop, the steady thunk of Jonas's axe rang out as he split kindling beside the cabin. Mary Beth stepped outside, pulling her threadbare shawl tighter around her shoulders. Her breath formed small clouds in the morning air as she watched Jonas work. His powerful shoulders flexed with each swing, the axe blade flashing in the sunlight as it descended. "I want to help with the chores," she said, her voice firm despite the cold making her shiver. "I won't be a burden." Jonas paused, resting the axe handle against his leg. "Ain't nobody called you that. All the same, I need to earn my keep." He nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Creek's just down that path," he said, pointing to a narrow trail through the pines. "Could use some fresh water for cooking." Mary Beth found 2 wooden buckets by the door and set off down the snowy path. The creek ran swift and clear, ice forming only at its edges. As she filled the buckets, the sound of children's laughter drifted down from the cabin. Samuel and Ruth had discovered a pair of old snowshoes leaning against the cabin wall. They examined the wooden frames and leather webbing with fascination, trying to imagine how anyone could walk on such strange devices. "Those were made by Ute friends," Jonas explained, showing them how the bindings worked. "Mighty useful when the snow gets deep." Back inside, Mary Beth set to work sweeping the hearth clean of ash and wood chips. She found Jonas's coat hanging by the door, a long tear in one sleeve. Without a word, she took up needle and thread from her small sewing kit and began mending the rough fabric. The morning sun climbed higher as Jonas prepared a simple breakfast. The smell of cornbread baking in the cast-iron skillet filled the cabin, mingling with the rich aroma of coffee. When the food was ready, they gathered around the rough-hewn table. Over the meal, Jonas's quiet voice broke the comfortable silence. "Tell me about Daniel, if you don't mind my asking." Mary Beth's hand stilled on her cup. "He was a good man. Worked hard on our homestead." She swallowed hard before continuing. "Pneumonia took him last spring. He'd been out fixing fences in the rain for days." "I'm sorry," Jonas said simply. After he passed, Mr. Bell came calling about money Daniel supposedly owed for supplies. Her voice grew bitter. The interest kept growing until he said the homestead was forfeit. We had nowhere else to go. Jonas's frown deepened as he listened. Seems mighty convenient for Bell, collecting debts that way. He showed me papers with Daniel's mark. The ... double quotes. Mary Beth hesitated. Daniel could read and write. He never would have just made his mark. "Reckon I ought to ride into town in a few days. Take a look at those papers myself." Jonas poured more coffee into their cups. "Trip'll be slow with all this snow, but might be worth knowing exactly what Bell's claiming." Ruth reached for another piece of cornbread, her small face serious. "Can we go home then, Mama?" "We'll see, sweetheart," Mary Beth answered softly. Though her heart ached at the hope in her daughter's voice, as evening settled over the mountain, they gathered around the hearth. The fire cast dancing shadows on the log walls as Jonas worked. At mending his steel traps, his big hands surprisingly gentle with the delicate mechanisms. Samuel watched him intently, asking quiet questions about how the traps worked and what kind of animals Jonas caught. Ruth and Samuel began a clapping game they'd learned at school, their rhyming song filling the cabin with cheerful sound. Mary Beth sat in Jonas's chair, working on darning a hole in Samuel's sock. The familiar motion of needle and thread soothed her, and for the first time in months, she felt something close to peace. Yet worry still clouded her mind like storm clouds on the horizon. What if Bell's papers were legal, despite her suspicions? What would become of them then? She watched Jonas showing Samuel how to oil a trap spring, his patience with the boy touching something deep in her heart. The fire crackled softly, and outside, the wind whispered through the pines. For now at least, they were warm, fed, and safe. Mary Beth offered up a silent prayer of thanks, though she knew their troubles were far from over. 2 days after their discussion about the papers, Jonas hitched his mule to a small sleigh outside the cabin. The morning sun cast long shadows across the snow as Mary Beth bundled up in an extra shawl Jonas had found in his trunk. They'd agreed to leave the children with Widow Larkin, a kindly neighbor who lived a mile down the mountain trail. "You sure about this?" Jonas asked as he helped Mary Beth onto the wooden seat. "Trail's mighty rough with all this snow." "I need to see those papers myself," Mary Beth replied, her jaw set with determination. The widow's cabin appeared through the trees, smoke curling from its stone chimney. Sarah Larkin stood in the doorway, her silver hair tucked beneath a wool cap. She welcomed Samuel and Ruth with warm hugs and promises of fresh-baked cookies. "Don't you fret none," the widow assured Mary Beth. "These young'uns will be just fine with me." The journey to Snowcap proved challenging. Deep drifts blocked portions of the narrow mountain road, forcing them to stop twice. Jonas climbed down each time, his boots sinking deep as he shoveled paths. Through the worst spots, Mary Beth insisted on helping, though her hands grew numb despite her mittens. "Reminds me of last winter," she said, leaning on the shovel. "Daniel and I clearing the path to our barn." Her voice caught on her late husband's name. Jonas simply nodded, understanding in his eyes. They pressed on, the mule's hooves crunching through the crusty snow. By mid-afternoon, The town's scattered buildings came into view, smoke rising from chimneys against the pale winter sky. Jonas guided the sleigh straight to Horace Bell's general store. The brass bell above the door jangled as they entered, and the warmth inside made Marybeth's cold cheeks sting. Bell stood behind his polished counter, his usual pristine suit at odds with the rough frontier town. Well, Bell drawled, his thin lips curving into what might have been a smile. To what do I owe this pleasure? Need to see the papers on the Cullen property, Jonas said, his voice level but firm. Bell's eyebrows rose slightly. That's a private business matter between Mrs. Cullen and myself. Show us the ledger, Marybeth spoke up, her voice stronger than she felt. After a moment's hesitation, Bell reached beneath the counter and produced a leather-bound book and a separate document. He laid them out, his manicured fingers smoothing the pages with exaggerated care. Jonas studied the ledger entries, his frown deepening at the columns of numbers. The separate paper showed a property lien with what appeared to be Daniel's signature scrawled at the bottom. That's not right, Marybeth said, leaning closer. Daniel was too sick to hold a pen when ... She stopped, her throat tight with emotion. Your husband signed this document of his own free will, Bell said smoothly. As you can see, everything is quite legal. Jonas's finger traced down the ledger columns. These interest rates ain't legal. No territorial court would uphold them. Bell's smirk hardened slightly. I suggest you mind your own affairs, Mr. Rourke. Your reputation in these parts is questionable enough already. I want a copy of these papers, Jonas said, ignoring the threat in Bell's words. I'm afraid that won't be possible. Bell closed the ledger with a sharp snap. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have paying customers to attend to. Jonas placed both palms flat on the counter, his large frame looming over Bell. Then I reckon the territorial magistrate might take an interest in your bookkeeping. Bell's face flushed, but he kept his composure. Make whatever accusations you like. The property is mine now, legally and properly. Outside the store, they passed the telegraph office. Through the window, Marybeth caught sight of Reverend Halley. The elderly preacher looked up from his conversation with the telegraph operator and gave her a gentle nod, his kind eyes crinkling at the corners. The small gesture of friendship warmed her heart, though the stares from other townsfolk remained as cold as the winter air. Dusk was falling as they started the long climb back up the mountain. The mule's breath streamed in the fading light, and the sleigh runners creaked over the frozen snow. Marybeth huddled closer to Jonas for warmth, her mind churning with worry over what they'd learned. Those numbers weren't right, Jonas said quietly, breaking the silence. Bell's been cooking his books, sure as sunrise. Marybeth nodded, remembering the impossible sums that had seemed to multiply every time Bell presented them. But how can we prove it? The question hung in the cold air as they continued their slow journey home, the first stars beginning to glimmer in the darkening sky above the snow-covered pines. Morning brought a fierce mountain wind that shook the cabin's sturdy walls. The shutters rattled against their leather ties, and drafts whistled through the smallest gaps in the logs. Marybeth woke to find fresh snow had drifted halfway up the window panes during the night. Jonas stood at the door, peering out at the white world beyond. Trails blocked solid, he said, closing the door against a gust that sent snow swirling inside. Won't be going anywhere today. The children didn't seem to mind being trapped indoors. Samuel helped Jonas gather kindling from the box by the hearth, while Ruth sat cross-legged on a bearskin rug, playing with a corn-husk doll Jonas had found in his trunk. As the morning wore on, Jonas settled at the rough-hewn table with a broken chair, his big hands working carefully with wood glue and clamps. The chair leg had split clean through, probably from the cold. Might need more blankets before nightfall, Marybeth said, rubbing her arms against the chill. This wind's got a bite to it. Jonas looked up from his work. There's an old trunk. Under the loft stairs should be some wool blankets in there. Mary Beth found the trunk easily enough, a battered cavalry chest with brass fittings gone green with age. The hinges creaked as she lifted the lid, releasing the familiar scent of cedar. She sorted through folded quilts and blankets, but something caught her eye: an envelope, yellowed with age and tied with faded string. Her heart nearly stopped when she saw the name written across the front, Daniel Cullen. With trembling fingers, she untied the string. Inside was a letter in her husband's careful handwriting, the sight of it bringing tears to her eyes. As she read, her hands began to shake. "Jonas," she called, her voice unsteady. "You need to see this." He set down his tools and crossed the room, taking the paper she held out. His eyes moved quickly over the words as Mary Beth explained. "It's an agreement between Daniel and Chief Red Elk of the Ute tribe. They agreed to let our cattle graze on their summer pastures in exchange for payment each autumn." She wiped her eyes with her apron. "Daniel never told me about this. He handled all the business dealings himself." Jonas nodded slowly. "This could be important. Shows your husband had proper income coming in, income Bell probably didn't account for when he tallied up that so-called debt." The wind howled outside, rattling the windows in their frames. Ruth looked up from her doll, startled by the sound, but Samuel just added another log to the fire. "Could this help us?" Mary Beth asked, hope rising in her chest for the first time in months. "Might could," Jonas replied, studying the paper again. "Red Elk's a fair man. If he confirms this agreement, it would show Daniel was earning honest money. That would cast doubt on Bell's whole claim." Throughout the day, the storm raged on. Snow piled higher against the cabin walls, but inside remained warm and snug. Jonas hung heavy quilts over the windows to block the drafts, and the stone fireplace radiated steady heat. By afternoon, the cabin filled with the rich smell of rabbit stew simmering in the iron pot. Mary Beth kept returning to the letter, reading it over and over. She could almost hear Daniel's voice in the careful phrases, see him bent over their kitchen table, writing it out by lamplight. The paper was proof that he'd been thinking ahead, working to provide for them right up until it ended. As evening approached, the wind began to die down. Jonas stood at the window, pushing the quilt aside to study the sky. "Storm's breaking," he said. "Once the road's clear, we should ride out to the Ute camp. Red Elk winters his people in the sheltered valley beyond Thunder Creek. Will he remember the agreement?" Mary Beth asked, spooning stew into wooden bowls for the children. "Red Elk's got a long memory for promises made and kept," Jonas replied. "If Daniel dealt fair with him, and this letter shows he meant to, the chief will remember." That night, after the children were asleep in the loft, Mary Beth sat by the fire, holding Daniel's letter close to her heart. The cabin was quiet, except for the crack of burning logs and the soft whisper of wind in the chimney. For the first time since Daniel's death, she felt something more than grief and fear. She felt hope small and fragile as a newly kindled flame. But hope nonetheless thought. Jonas sat in his chair by the hearth, whittling a small wooden horse for Ruth. He looked up, catching Mary Beth's eye. "We'll get to the truth of this," he said quietly. "Your husband seems to have been an honorable man. That counts for something with folk like Red Elk." Mary Beth nodded, carefully folding the letter and returning it to its envelope. Outside, the storm had passed, leaving the mountain world silent under its blanket of fresh snow. 2 days after discovering Daniel's letter, the mountain trails had finally hardened enough for travel. The morning sun cast long shadows across the fresh snow as Jonas loaded his mule with careful precision. He wrapped provisions in oilcloth salt, pork from his smokehouse, coffee beans in a leather pouch, and a small sack of flour. "I'm coming with you," Mary Beth said, pulling on her patched wool coat. Her tone left no room for argument. Jonas nodded, understanding her need to hear the truth. Firsthand. Trail's rough, he warned, checking the mule's lead rope. But we can make it there and back before dark if we start now. They left the children with Widow Larkin, whose small cabin sat nestled among the pines a mile down the trail. The elderly woman welcomed them warmly, already teaching Ruth to card wool while Samuel helped stack firewood. "They'll be safe here," the widow assured Mary Beth, patting her hand. "Got fresh bread in the oven and stories to tell." The journey to the Ute winter camp wound through snow-covered hills and narrow valleys. Jonas led the way, his mule picking, carefully over frozen streams and around ice-slick rocks. Mary Beth followed on Jonas's bay horse, clutching Daniel's letter inside her coat. By early afternoon, thin wisps of smoke appeared above the trees-cooked fires from the Ute lodges. Jonas raised his hand in greeting as two mounted scouts approached. They exchanged words in the Ute language, and the scouts nodded, turning their horses to lead the way into camp. The winter camp spread through a sheltered valley, lodges arranged in a careful circle. Children played in the snow while women worked at smoking racks hung with strips of venison. The scouts led them directly to a large lodge at the center of camp. Chief Red Elk emerged, wrapped in a blanket decorated with bold geometric patterns. His face was weathered by years in the mountain winds, but his eyes were sharp and alert. He greeted Jonas with a firm handshake, then turned to study Mary Beth. "I remember your husband," he said in clear English, gesturing for them to enter his lodge. Inside, a fire burned in the central pit, making the space warm and smoky. They sat on woven mats while Red Elk's wife poured coffee into tin cups, Mary Beth's. Hands trembled slightly as she withdrew Daniel's letter. "My husband made an agreement with you," she said, holding out the paper, "about grazing cattle on your summer lands." Red Elk took the letter, though he barely glanced at it. "Daniel Cullen was an honest man," he said. "We agreed his cattle would graze our high meadows when the snow melted. In return, he would bring payment each autumn." He handed the letter back. "When spring came and he did not arrive, we heard he had died. We grieved for his passing." Tears welled in Mary Beth's eyes. "The storekeeper in town, Horace Bell, he claims Daniel owed him money, but our land is forfeit for debt." The chief's expression hardened. Bell speaks with a forked tongue. "Your husband paid fairly for what he bought. We were waiting for him to bring the agreed payment this past autumn." "Would you tell this to the territorial authorities?" Jonas asked. "Your word carries weight with them." Red Elk nodded. "I will speak truth. My nephew writes English well. He will put our words on paper now, so there can be no mistake." The chief's nephew, a young man in a wool trade coat, brought paper and ink. Under Red Elk's direction, he wrote out a clear statement about the grazing agreement and Daniel's good standing with the tribe. The chief marked it with his sign, and his nephew signed as witness. Before they left, Red Elk's wife insisted they share a meal. They sat around the fire, eating tender roasted venison and fresh flatbread. Mary Beth accepted each bite gratefully, touched by the hospitality. She saw now what Jonas had meant about Red Elk's fairness. The chief treated them with the same respect Daniel had shown him. The sun was setting as they mounted up for the ride home, painting the snow-covered peaks in shades of rose and gold. The signed statement was safely tucked inside Mary Beth's coat beside Daniel's letter. Each step of their horses taking them closer to home felt lighter, as if a great weight had begun to lift from her shoulders. This could be the rope that pulls you out of Bell's trap, Jonas said quietly as they rode. The words hung in the crystal mountain air, carrying the first real promise of justice Mary Beth had felt since Daniel's death. She touched the papers through her coat, feeling their solid presence. Her husband's good name was cleared, not just by words, but by the respect these people still held for him. For the first time since the morning at the gallows, she sat straight in the saddle, Her head held high. The next week brought a flurry of activity to Jonas's cabin. Each morning, he and Mary Beth spread papers across the rough-hewn table, piecing together their case against Horace Bell. Samuel and Ruth played quietly in the loft, sensing the importance of their work below. One crisp morning, they hitched the mule to Jonas's wagon and drove into Snowcap to visit Reverend Holly. The preacher's small house sat behind the white-painted church, smoke curling from its chimney into the winter sky. Holly welcomed them into his study, where a pot of coffee steamed on the pot-bellied stove. "I've been expecting you," he said, gesturing to warm leather chairs. "Word travels fast about your visit to the U-Camp." Mary Beth smoothed her skirt nervously. "Reverend, we need your help. You visited Daniel when he was sick. You know, he was too weak to sign anything near the end." The old preacher nodded gravely, running a hand through his silver hair. "I was there most days that last month, reading scripture and praying with him." His hand shook so badly he could barely hold his Bible. He looked directly at Jonas. "If Bell claims Daniel signed papers, then it's false witness, plain and simple." "Would you put that in writing?" Jonas asked. "For the territorial magistrate, of course." Holly moved to his desk and began writing in a careful hand. "But I must warn you, both Bell has deep roots here. He's got half the town council in his pocket and makes regular donations to the Territorial Orphan Board." He glanced meaningfully at Mary Beth's children, who waited outside with Jonas's dogs. Mary Beth's face paled, but her voice stayed steady. "We have to try, for Daniel's sake, and the children's." Back at the cabin, they settled into evening routines that felt almost like family. While Jonas sharpened his axe and hunting knives by the fire, Mary Beth sat with Ruth at the table, teaching her to make neat stitches on a scrap of cotton. Samuel often watched Jonas work, asking questions about the tools and offering to help. "Carry firewood. Like this, Mama?" Ruth held up her crooked seam, face hopeful in the lamplight. "That's fine work," Mary Beth smiled, her heart aching with love for her children. "Your papa would be proud to see you learning so well." Jonas looked up from his work, something soft crossing his weathered features. He said nothing, but Mary Beth caught his glance and felt warm by it. They planned their journey to Granite City carefully. It would take a full day's hard riding to reach the territorial magistrate's office, and winter weather could turn treacherous without warning. Jonas pulled out maps, marking the safest route through the passes. Widow Larkin didn't hesitate when they asked her to watch the children. "They're welcome as sunshine," she said, her kind face crinkling. "Samuel's getting right handy with splitting kindling, and Ruth keeps my old hands busy with her questions about weaving." The evening before they left, Mary Beth packed their provisions, while Jonas checked over the wagon one last time. They loaded blankets, a small canvas tent, salt pork, coffee, and hardtack. Most precious was the oilskin packet containing their evidence, Chief Red Elk's statement, Daniel's original letter, and Reverend Hale's affidavit. They rose before dawn, the mountain air bitter with cold. After leaving the children with tearful hugs at Widow Larkin's, they set out just as the sky began to lighten. The wagon wheels creaked over the frozen ground, and their breath clouded in the early morning air. The trail wound through silent white woods, snow clinging to pine boughs. Overhead, Mary Beth pulled her shawl tighter, watching the sun slowly climb above the eastern peaks. The only sounds were the horses' hooves and the occasional cry of a winter bird. "Dear Lord," she began praying aloud, her voice barely above a whisper, "give us strength for what's ahead. Watch over Samuel and Ruth while we're gone. Help us find justice, if it be your will." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "And thank you for sending friends to help us in our need." Jonas sat beside her on the wagon seat, his jaw set against the cutting wind. He didn't speak, but his presence felt like a solid wall at her side, protecting her from the cold. His eyes stayed fixed on the trail ahead, scanning for any sign of danger or trouble. The sun climbed higher as they continued their journey, the wagon rolling steadily toward Granite City and whatever justice they might find there. Mary Beth touched the oilskin packet tucked safely in her coat, praying it would be enough to save her children's future. The mountain trail to Granite City proved more treacherous than they expected. Ice glazed the narrow path, forcing them to slow their pace. When the mule's hooves began slipping on a particularly steep stretch, Jonas pulled the wagon to a halt. "We'll have to lead him through these patches," he said, jumping down from the seat. He offered his hand to help Mary Beth descend. "Watch your step here. Watch your step here." The cold bit through Mary Beth's warm boots as they picked their way forward. Jonas led the mule while she walked beside the wagon, one hand on the side panel to steady herself. Their breath came out in white puffs, and the winter sun offered little warmth. By late afternoon, their muscles ached from the careful navigation of icy stretches as dusk approached. Jonas guided them into a sheltered hollow where thick pines blocked the worst of the wind. He quickly set up their small canvas tent while Mary Beth gathered dry kindling from under the snow-laden branches. Soon a small fire crackled, casting dancing shadows on the surrounding trees. Jonas pulled out a loaf of bread and held it over the flames on a forked stick. The warmth slowly brought feeling back to their cold-numbed fingers. Mary Beth watched the bread brown, her mind churning with worry. What if the law sides with Bell? She finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "He has money, influence. We have papers and promises." Jonas turned the bread carefully before answering. "Truth has its own weight," he said. "Maybe it's slow to tip the scales, but it tips them all the same." He broke the warm bread in half, passing a share. "I've seen justice come through before, even when powerful men stood against it." They slept fitfully that night, taking turns, keeping the fire fed. The wolves howled in the distance, and the wind whistled through the pines. Mary Beth dreamed of her children, their faces blurred with worry. By mid-morning the next day, they crossed the last ridge and saw Granite City spread out below them. The mining town bustled with activity wagons rolling through muddy streets, miners trudging to and from the silver mines, smoke rising from 100 chimneys. The territorial magistrate's office sat in a red brick building near the town center. Judge Moffat, a thin man with tired eyes and iron-gray hair, looked up from his desk as they entered. His office smelled of tobacco and old leather. "What brings you folks all this way?" he asked, gesturing to the wooden chairs before his desk. Mary Beth's hands trembled as she laid out their evidence. Jonas explained about Bell's suspicious lien, Daniel's grazing agreement with the Ute, and Reverend Hale's testimony. The judge examined each document carefully, making notes in a leather-bound ledger. "This requires proper review," Moffat said finally, looking up at them. "I'll need a week to examine the records and consult with the Territorial Land Office. I'll send word to Snowcap when I reach my decision." Relief and anxiety warred in Mary Beth's chest as they stepped back into the cold afternoon air. At least the judge had listened, had taken their claims seriously. They had just reached their wagon when running footsteps approached. A telegraph boy, his cap askew, held out a yellow paper. "Message from Mrs. Cullen," he called out. Mary Beth's hands shook so badly that Jonas had to take the telegram. He read Widow Larkin's message aloud. "Men from Orphan Board came. Took children. To Snowcap. Hurry." The world tilted sideways. Mary Beth's knees gave way, and she would have fallen if Jonas hadn't caught her arm. Her chest felt crushed, as if all the air had been squeezed from her lungs. "No," she gasped. No. We'll get them back," Jonas said, his voice hard with determination. He helped her up to the wagon's seat. "This is Bell's doing, trying to force our hand, but we won't let him win." They set out immediately, not even stopping for supplies. The afternoon sun cast long shadows as they pushed the mule as fast as they dared on the icy trail. Every mile seemed to stretch endlessly, every delay an agony. The cold wind cut deeper now, carrying the weight of fear for Samuel and Ruth. Mary Beth clutched her shawl around her shoulders, praying silently through chattering teeth. She could picture her children, frightened and confused, wondering why. Strange men had taken them away. The thought drove splinters into her heart. Jonas kept his eyes on the trail, his jaw clenched tight. "We'll ride through the night if we have to," he said. "We'll bring them home." The sun sank behind the mountains, painting the snow-covered peaks in shades of rose and gold. But Mary Beth barely noticed the beauty. Her whole world had narrowed to the road ahead and the desperate need to reach her children. Darkness settled over the mountains like a heavy blanket as Jonas and Mary Beth's wagon finally rolled into Snowcap. The streets lay empty and silent, with only yellow lamplight spilling from the saloon windows onto the fresh snow. A dog barked in the distance, and somewhere a shutter creaked in the winter wind. Mary Beth gripped the wagon seat, her knuckles white. "The orphan board office," she said, her voice hoarse from crying. "We have to go now. My babies are there. They must be scared." Jonas pulled gentle pressure on the reins, turning the mule toward Widow Larkin's cottage on the edge of town. "You're exhausted, Mary Beth. We both are. Walking in there half dead from the trail won't help Samuel and Ruth." "But they need me," she protested weakly, even as exhaustion dragged at her bones. "And they need you clear-headed," Jonas said firmly. "Widow Larkin will know more about what happened. We'll rest a few hours and face this proper in the morning." The widow's cottage glowed with warm lamplight as they approached. She opened the door before they could knock, her weathered face creased with worry. "Oh, thank the Lord you're back," she said, ushering them inside. "I tried to stop them. I truly did." Mary Beth sank into a chair by the fire, her legs trembling. "Tell me everything," she whispered. Widow Larkin poured them both cups of hot coffee before settling into her rocking chair. "2 men from the Territorial Orphan Board came yesterday morning. They had papers citing unfit living conditions and improper guardianship on account of you staying at Mr. Rourke's cabin." She shook her head sadly. "They wouldn't listen when I told them how well you care for those children." "Improper guardianship?" Mary Beth's voice cracked. "I've done everything to keep them safe, fed." "It's Belle's doing," Jonas said quietly from where he sat at the simple wooden table. He pulled out his pocket knife and a small piece of pine wood. "He's trying to pressure us into dropping the case against him." Mary Beth paced the small room, her shadow dancing on the walls. Sometimes she stopped to stare out the window at the dark street, as if willing her children to appear. Other times she knelt by the hearth, whispering prayers through tears. The hours crawled by like years. Jonas remained at the table, his knife steadily working the piece of wood. Shavings curled onto the floor as a small horse gradually emerged from the block. His face stayed set in grim concentration, but his eyes followed Mary Beth's restless movement. When the first gray light of dawn crept over the mountains, Mary Beth had dark circles under her eyes from her sleepless vigil. She pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders. "It's time," she said. They walked through the silent morning streets to the orphan board office, their boots crunching in the fresh snow. The office occupied a small building next to the newspaper office, its windows dark. They waited on the front step for nearly an hour before the clerk arrived, fumbling with his keys in the cold. He barely glanced at them as he unlocked the door. "The Cullen children," Mary Beth said, following him inside. "Where are they?" The clerk shuffled through some papers on his desk. "Ah, yes. They were transferred to the Granite City holding home yesterday afternoon. Standard procedure until permanent placement can be arranged." Mary Beth swayed on her feet. Jonas steadied her with a hand on her elbow. permanent placement?" She whispered. "Yes, ma'am. Good Christian families are always looking to adopt. I'm sure they'll find suitable homes soon enough." The clerk's tone suggested the matter was settled. The room spun around Mary Beth. Her children, her precious babies, sent away to be given to strangers. She clutched her shawl, feeling faint. The walls seemed to press in around her. Jonas's voice cut through her panic, hard as iron. "Then we ride back." "Sir?" The clerk looked up, startled by his tone. "To Granite City," Jonas said. "Now." He turned to Mary Beth, his eyes softening slightly. "We'll bring them home." The clerk cleared his throat. "The board's decision is final. Any appeal would have to go through proper channels, which could take weeks." "We're going," Mary Beth said, finding her voice again. She straightened her spine, drawing on some deep well of strength. "Those are my children, and I'm not letting anyone take them from me." They walked out into the brightening morning, leaving, the clerk sputtering behind them. The sun was just touching the mountaintops, painting them gold, but Mary Beth barely noticed. Her mind was already on the long road back to Granite City, and her children waiting at the end of it. The return journey to Granite City stretched long and silent. Jonas's mule plodded steadily through the snow, while Mary Beth stared straight ahead, her hands clenched in her lap. The winter sun cast their shadows far across the white drifts, and their breath fogged in the bitter air. Neither spoke much. What was there to say? Every mother's nightmare had come true for Mary Beth. Her children taken, given to strangers who saw them as mere charges to be distributed. Jonas watched her from the corner of his eye, noting how she clutched her warm Bible close to her chest. They reached Granite City as morning bells chimed from the little church. The Holding home stood on the edge of town, a stark 3-story building with narrow windows. As they approached, Mary Beth suddenly grabbed Jonas's arm. "Look," she whispered. "There." In the yard, 2 small figures swept snow from the wooden porch steps. Samuel worked with slow, mechanical movements, while little Ruth struggled with a broom nearly twice her size. Neither child looked up. Their shoulders slumped under thin coats. Mary Beth's feet barely touched the ground as she leaped from the wagon. "Samuel! Ruth!" The children's heads snapped up. "Mama!" Ruth dropped her broom with a clatter. Before they could run to her, a stern-faced woman in a dark dress appeared in the doorway. "Children, inside, now." Her voice cracked like a whip. Samuel and Ruth hesitated, tears welling in their eyes as they looked at their mother. The matron clapped her hands sharply. "Inside." They shuffled through the door, casting desperate glances over their shoulders. Mary Beth surged forward, but the matron blocked her path. "Those children are under the protection of the Territorial Orphan Board," she said, her chin lifted. "The charges of unfit conditions and improper guardianship stand. They're my children." Mary Beth's voice shook with fury and grief. "You have no right. I have every right." The matron's lips pressed into a thin line. "A widow living unchaperoned with a strange man. The board's decision is quite clear." Jonas stepped forward, his tall frame casting a shadow across the porch. "Then we'll see the magistrate." "Now, the magistrate is very busy. He'll see us." Jonas's quiet certainty seemed to unsettle the matron. He turned to Mary Beth. "Get the papers." From her shawl, Mary Beth pulled out their precious documents: Chief Red Elk's written statement, Reverend Hale's affidavit, and Daniel's original letter. Jonas took them carefully. "Stay here," he told her softly. "Watch the children. I'll bring Moffat." The magistrate's office was only 2 streets away. Jonas returned within the hour, Judge Moffat hurrying beside him. The judge looked troubled as Jonas explained the situation. "This is highly irregular," Moffat said, frowning at the matron. "Why wasn't I informed of this action against Mrs. Cullen? The board has autonomy in these matters. the matron began. Not when they involve treaty rights, Moffat cut in, studying Chief Red Elk's statement. This grazing agreement has significant implications. A commotion at the gate drew their attention. Chief Red Elk himself stood there, his face grave beneath his hat. 2 young Ute men flanked him, having clearly ridden hard to reach the city. "Word reached me," the chief said simply, crossing the yard. His presence filled the small space with quiet authority. The matron took an unconscious step back. Moffat bowed slightly. "Chief Red Elk, you've come at a crucial moment. I have come to speak truth." Red Elk's eyes swept over the scene, the crying children watching from a window, Maribeth's desperate face, the matron's rigid posture. Daniel Cullen was an honorable man. His widow honors his agreements. To harm this family would poison relations between our peoples. He paused, letting the words settle. The town's herds need summer grazing. They need clean water from our streams. These things depend on trust and respect. The magistrate nodded slowly, understanding the implications. He turned to the matron. "Release the children to their mother immediately. But the board's regulations can be reviewed at a later date." Moffat's tone brooked no argument. "For now, these children belong with their mother." The matron's face tightened, but she turned stiffly and went inside. Moments later, Samuel and Ruth burst through the door, running straight into Maribeth's open arms. She gathered them close, tears streaming down her face as she kissed their heads again and again. Red Elk watched the reunion with quiet satisfaction. He caught Jonas's eye and nodded once, a gesture of respect between men who understood the importance of keeping one's word. Judge Moffat sat behind his broad oak desk, shuffling through the papers one final time. The late afternoon sun slanted through his office windows, casting long shadows across the worn floorboards. Maribeth stood with her hands clasped tightly, while Jonas remained near the door, his tall frame casting a protective presence. Horace Bell occupied a chair near the window, his polished boots crossed at the ankles and an expression of calculated indifference on his face. The matron from the children's home stood rigid beside him, her mouth pinched into a thin line. "Having reviewed all evidence presented," Judge Moffat began, his voice carrying the weight of authority, "I find several matters that require immediate address." He lifted the document bearing Chief Red Elk's testimony. First, the grazing agreement between Daniel Cullen and the Ute tribe represents a legitimate business arrangement that should have been considered when assessing the family's financial status. Bell shifted in his chair, his fingers drumming against the armrest. The judge continued, "Furthermore, the lien presented by Mr. Bell contains irregularities that cast doubt on its validity. The signature was obtained while Mr. Cullen was gravely ill, as attested by Reverend Hale's sworn statement." Moffat's gavel rapped sharply against the desktop. "I hereby nullify the lien against the Cullen homestead." He turned, his stern gaze toward the matron. "As to the matter of custody, I find no evidence supporting the charges of unfitness. Mrs. Cullen has demonstrated both the means and character to care for her children properly." "Your Honor," Bell interrupted, rising to his feet. "The woman was caught stealing. An act of desperation," Moffat cut in, "brought about by circumstances that this court now finds were wrongfully imposed. The debt has been settled by Mr. Rourke's payment and restitution made." He lifted his gavel again. "This court orders the immediate release of Samuel and Ruth Cullen to their mother's custody, with all rights restored." The crack of the gavel echoed through the room. Bell's face darkened as he snatched his hat from the rack. "Law favoring the undeserving," he muttered, loud enough to be heard as he stalked toward the door. "Mark my words, this sets a dangerous precedent." Jonas stepped aside to let him pass, but his eyes followed Bell until the door slammed shut behind him. The matron departed with a stiff nod, leaving only the sound of her boots clicking down the hallway. Mary Beth hardly noticed their exit. Her heart pounded as she turned toward the small anteroom where Samuel and Ruth waited. They burst through the door at her gesture, and she dropped to her knees, gathering them both in her arms. Their small bodies pressed against her, warm and solid and real. "Mama," Ruth whispered, her face buried in Mary Beth's shawl. "Can we go home now?" "Yes, my darling." Mary Beth's voice caught as she kissed their faces again and again, until Samuel squirmed with embarrassment. "Mama, people are watching," he protested, though his hands still clutched her skirts. Jonas stood back near the wall, arms crossed over his chest. A faint smile softened his weathered features as he watched the reunion. When Mary Beth finally looked up, her eyes shining with tears, he nodded toward the window. "Getting late. Best we find lodging for the night." They found rooms at a modest boarding house run by a plump woman named Mrs. Kendrick. She took one look at the children's tired faces and clucked her tongue. "Poor dears. Kitchen's nearly closed, but I reckon we can manage something hot for supper." The dining room was warm and smelled of roasted chicken and fresh bread. Ruth fell asleep at the table, her head drooping over her plate until Jonas carefully lifted her and carried her upstairs. Samuel insisted on walking up himself, though his steps dragged with exhaustion. In their small room, Mary Beth tucked the children into the narrow bed. She sat in a rough wooden chair by the window, listening to their steady breathing in the darkness. The fear that had lived in her chest for so many months, the terror of losing them, of failing as a mother, finally began to loosen its grip. Through the thin walls, she could hear Jonas moving about in the adjacent room, his footsteps solid and reassuring. Tomorrow they would begin the journey home, back to her homestead that was truly hers again. But tonight she simply watched her children sleep, free from the shadow of separation that had haunted them all. Samuel stirred, mumbling something in his dreams. Mary Beth reached out to smooth his hair, her touch gentle so as not to wake him. Ruth snuggled closer to her brother, their dark heads sharing the same pillow. Outside, snow began to fall softly past the window, but the room was warm. And her children were safe, and for the first time in longer than she could remember. Mary Beth felt peace settle over her like a familiar quilt. The journey home wound through snow-laden pines, their branches bowing under white blankets. The mood was different now. Samuel and Ruth chattered from the back of the wagon, their voices bright against the winter silence. Even Mary Beth's shoulders seemed lighter, as if the weight of months of worry had finally lifted. Jonas guided the mule off the main trail toward the Ute camp. Smoke rose in thin spirals against the pale sky, and children playing in the snow called out greetings. Chief Red Elk emerged from his lodge, raising his hand in welcome. "We came to thank you," Mary Beth said, her voice thick with gratitude. "Without your help. The chief nodded, understanding in his dark eyes. He disappeared into his lodge and returned with a wooden box, its surface adorned with intricate carvings of mountains and running deer. "For a fresh start," he said, placing it in her hands. "May it hold good memories." Mary Beth traced the carvings with trembling fingers. "Thank you," she whispered. When they reached Snowcap, the winter sun was setting behind the mountains. The sudden peal of church bells startled them. Reverend Hawley stood in the bell tower, calling townspeople to gather. They came in twos and threes, boots crunching in the snow. Standing on the church steps, Mary Beth faced her neighbors. Her voice shook at first but grew stronger as she spoke. "I want to thank those who stood beside me when I had nothing left." She turned to Jonas, who hung back in the shadows. "Especially this man, who saved not just my life, but my children's future when he stopped that hanging." Reverend Hawley stepped forward, his weathered face gentle. "Sometimes the Lord's answers come in unexpected ways," he said. even in the form of a stranger appearing at just the right moment. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Mrs. Peterson, the baker's wife, pushed forward. "When spring comes, Tom and I will help fix your roof," she offered. Others joined, in promises of lumber, of labor, of fresh-baked bread for the workers. Mary Beth pressed her hand to her mouth, overwhelmed by the sudden outpouring of support. Jonas stood quietly at the edge of the crowd, a slight smile touching his lips as he watched the community gather around her like a warm cloak against the winter cold. Spring came softly to the mountains, bringing with it the drip of melting icicles and the first brave shoots of green pushing through patches of lingering snow. Inside the small white church, sunlight streamed through windows onto worn wooden pews, filled with a mix of faces, weathered settlers and dignified youth families seated side by side. Maribeth stood before Reverend Hall, her cheeks flushed pink above her best blue dress. Jonas towered beside her, his usually wild beard trimmed neat, wearing a fresh-pressed shirt that still showed creases from its paper wrapping. Samuel and Ruth fidgeted at their sides, the boy tugging at his collar while his sister twirled the ribbon in her hair. Widow Larkin dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief from her seat in the front pew. Chief Red Elk sat with quiet grace, his presence lending weight to the ceremony. The old chief's eyes held approval as he watched the couple join hands. In the eyes of God in this gathering, Reverend Hale's voice carried clear and strong. "I now pronounce you man and wife." After the ceremony, they returned to the cabin, their home now, where the rich smell of bubbling stew filled the air. Lantern light caught the steam rising from bowls of cornbread as neighbors crowded around the rough-hewn table, sharing stories and laughter. Jonas sat in his chair by the fire, his big hands moving with surprising delicacy as he carved. Wood shavings curled away from his knife, revealing the shape of a galloping horse for Samuel and a sweet-faced doll for Ruth. The children watched in wonder as their new toys took shape. Mary Beth moved about the cabin, serving guests and humming Amazing Grace under her breath. The melody wove through the warm air along with the crackling of the fire and the murmur of conversation. Outside, fresh snowflakes drifted down winter's last gentle goodbye as spring crept up the mountainside. Mary Beth paused by the window, closing her eyes. Her lips moved in silent prayer, thanking God not just for surviving the darkness of the past year, but for the unexpected blessing of this new beginning, a home filled with love, laughter, and the promise of tomorrow. Thanks for tuning in. These stories remind us that life is more than headlines. It's about heartlines. Subscribe if you want more moments that make you pause, feel, and reflect.